Okay, shalom to everyone. And can we just start by a little wave or something so I know I'm being heard? Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so first of all, thanks to Ariel in Cape Town, who is manning the back end or the technical side, and greetings to everyone. You're going to forgive me for not greeting people personally because I'll definitely leave out somebody. So you're all noted, and I appreciate your joining and your support. And I start, as always, by pointing out that first of all, today is the beginning of just close to Purim, a few days before Purim, and it is the 18th of March. And I also start by thanking everyone who has supported our project. That's on the website. Many of you have made donations. That keeps us going, keeps me going, enables me to run the website and teach and publish and so on. So, as you probably know, we do these pre-Yom Tov events as sort of appreciation for, particularly for appreciation for people who are members of the newsletter and support me in various ways. So I certainly appreciate it. It's a pleasure to see you. And you are welcome, whether you're in Florida. I see at least one friend from Florida, and wherever you're from. So you're welcome. Let's talk about a Purim subject that I hope you'll find interesting and maybe a little offbeat, but I think that's the nature of Purim, isn't it? So I think I'm probably allowed to be a little offbeat, and I hope you'll enjoy this and gain an insight into something deep, and that is the question of laughter, humor and laughter. Let's try to analyze that, and follow me carefully, please, because there are a number of layers here and introductory elements that are needed. And I'll try to build it as carefully as possible, and I hope this will leave you with an insight into the human faculty of laughter and humor, as well as an insight into Purim, into Judaism and life in general, and also into Torah methodology. So concentrate, please, and let's try to see if we can think through the subject together. So we know that the month of Adar corresponds to laughter. The background to that is that we have 12 months of the year, and we have a statement in the Sefer Yetzirah, one of the very early foundational Kabbalistic works, that explains that every month of the year corresponds to a faculty, to an organ or limb of the body, and a physiological or functional aspect of the body. The reason for this, without going into too much detail and getting sidetracked, the reason is that the world has 12 perimeters, if you like, or what are known in the deeper wisdom as the 12 meridia. And that's because, again, without laboring the point, perhaps for another time, we live in a world that is bounded by 12 lines. That means what we in English conventionally call 3 dimensions. And of course, if you characterize 3 dimensions fully, what you're talking about is 6 poles, left, right, front, back, and up, down. Picture the 6 sides of a cube. And of course, a cube is fully characterized by 12 lines, right? There are 12 lines at the top, 12 lines at the bottom, the 12 lines that join them. So a cube really is bounded by 12 lines. And that's why we are talking about a reality that has 12 extensions. Of course, it goes without saying that the 13th is the point of unity of the 12. That's why in Hebrew the word echad adds up to 13, right? The letters of echad, aleph, chet, daled, add up to 13. The word ava, which means love, which is really unification, adds up to 13. And of course, everyone knows that's why Jews love the number of 13. And of course, that's why the non-Jewish world is allergic to 13. A non-Jewish fellow gets on a plane and he finds himself sitting in seat 13, he starts panicking. Right? Where we love it. Bar mitzvah is 13 because there's integration of all the parts into a unity. And so we could speak for a long time about that. Obviously, that's why there are 12 tribes vested in the unity of Yaakov, who's the father of all of them. And that's why there are 12 zodiac elements. That's the framework in time that we fit into, just like the 12 diagonals or perimeters of a cube. Time is always also characterized by 12 extensions. And this, again, this is a very broad idea. Now, the 12s are obviously parallel. By the way, I should point out to you, there are 12 letters in the Hebrew alphabet that are simple letters. There are 3 mother letters. There are 7 doubled letters in Hebrew, right? Letters that take a dagesh, like bet and chaf and so on. And then there are 12 pshutos, 12 simple letters, which are single letters, have no 2 forms. And those, again, are parallel to the 12 extensions. Now, what I'd like to focus on for the purpose of this discussion is that there are faculties of the body that correspond to the 12. So, for example, one of them is speaking, one is seeing, one is hearing, one is walking. Each of the months corresponds to a time. It should be obvious to everybody when I mention that the first of the months, namely Nisan, in which Pesach appears, is the month of speaking. Right? Doesn't take much imagination to realize what that is. Pesach, after all, is the mitzvah of Haggadah, telling the story. The very word Pesach breaks down into two words. Pesach, the mouth talks. And so it should come as no surprise that Nisan, the first of the months, is the month of talking. Obviously, we know the human being is a speaking being. That's the essence of the human creation. And again, you can take this in a further, almost without limit. The month of Adar, the month that we are occupying at the moment, the last month of the year, in the depth of winter, just before the spring breaks, right? The month potentially given to the greatest hopelessness. Again, the depth of winter, furthest away from the rejuvenation of spring and Pesach is Adar. And the physiological function, the human faculty of the month is laughter. Tzchok, laughter. The organ that it corresponds to happens to be the spleen. That I'll leave for another time. And that you can think about, why is the spleen? It's interesting, of course. Laughter is not a life-sustaining function, right? Not directly related to a life function. The spleen, as we know, you can live without. You may be compromised in some ways without a spleen, but you can certainly live without it. And I won't sidetrack today into discussing the spleen, but let's talk about laughter. This is the month of laughter. And obviously, the first thought that comes to the beginner's mind is the hilarity of Purim, the joking nature of Purim, the wearing of masks and disguises. Obviously, that is highly relevant. But what I'd like to go beneath the surface and see if we can explore this subject at a deep level. The question to ask is, there are many questions. First of all, why is 1/12 of human expression humor? Walking, seeing, talking, right? We can think of hearing. These are faculties that are readily understood as foundational. But laughing, right? If you look in evolutionary research, for example, evolutionists are very hard-pressed to explain laughter. What was the evolutionary mechanism that led to a sense of humor? The rest of the biological world functions fine without laughing. What is the survival value of laughter? And most of them conclude that it's an epiphenomenon. It's not really selected for in survival. It's some sort of epiphenomenon of a mind which itself probably, according to many evolutionists, is probably mostly an epiphenomenon in itself. But of course, we are taught by our great Torah that laughing is 1/12 of what it means to be human. It's certainly central to the human condition, and we need to understand that. Now, the next thing we observe is that the Torah is full of laughter. For example, the verse says, Yoshev b'shamayim Yitzchak, the one who sits in heaven is laughing. God is laughing at history. And we know that's a mocking laughter. You know, human laughter has many tones. One of the tones of human laughter is mockery, as we'll try to explain a little bit further. And God's laughter is mocking, and we know it because the verse continues, Hashem yilag lamo. God laughs at them and mocks them. So we're talking about God sitting in heaven, laughing in mockery at the wicked. And then what does that mean? We know that human history, Jewish history, certainly been no laughing matter. No question about that. Human history is soaked in blood, right? When humanity comes to answer for itself at the end of time, can you imagine the humiliation and the shame that humans will have to face God, having soaked the world in blood and ridiculous, completely unnecessary brutality? And God is sitting in heaven and laughing at this process. What does that mean? Another statement we have in a verse is Az Yemale Schreik Pinu. When we talk about the Messianic Advent, the coming of Mashiach, the verse says, then our mouth shall be full of laughter. Az Yemale. Then our mouth will be full of laughter. True to form, the Talmud learns from that statement a halachic principle. We have a very important notion that every verse in the Torah is instruction. It isn't only information, it is practical instruction. And here the question is, what practical instruction is there in Az Yemale Schreik Pinu? And the Talmud teaches that statement means that our mouth should not be full of laughter now. You need to laugh, you need to be happy. On contrary, even in the saddest of months, Adar, there needs to be a certain baseline simcha, but not full. It's insensitive to have a mouth full of laughter in a world that contains tragedy. And so as Jews, we break a glass at a wedding, we put a little bit of ash on the head of the chassan. Every Jewish home has a little square of wall that is unplastered. We remember that we're living in a tragic world of destruction. And so to have a mouth 100% full of laughter is not appropriate. But Az Yemale, in the Messianic era, when the world is set to rights, then our mouth shall be full of laughter. That's the practical outcome. By the way, a sensitive ear will realize that here the sages are talking on two levels. The simplistic level is that when the Mashiach arrives and the world finally comes right, our mouth will be full of laughter in relief and joy. But the sensitive ear realizes that the depth here is that when the Messiah arrives, that will be funny. The Messianic Advent will be a joke. And that definitely needs understanding. I'll give you maybe the most peculiar of all verses in the Torah that talks about laughter. And we have a verse that says that a woman of spiritual greatness laughs at the day of death. She laughs at the day of death. There's a preemptive laughter here. A woman, understanding what life's all about, can laugh at the notion of death. That is a very bizarre statement. And obviously the question that it begs is, first of all, why a woman? What is special about woman that enables her to laugh at death? And why is it a tradition to sing that to our wives on Friday nights? You know, in the whole Jewish world, the Ashkenazi world, the Sephardi world, there's a custom to sing Eshes Chayil. It's a beautiful song of praise of the greatness of a Jewish woman. And there is this deep verse that says that a woman of spiritual perfection can laugh at death. And that is extremely bizarre. What does that mean? So that's our challenge. We've set ourselves in this discussion to analyze the question of laughter, plumb the depth of what the Torah means when it talks about the faculty of laughter, and try to explain some of these peculiar verses. Now let's move into the second part of our discussion, and that is methodology. When you're faced with a conundrum like this, a Torah subject that is perplexing, what method do you use to plumb it? You know, most of us know, no matter how religious or not yet religious you are, if I ask you to give me a talk on the laws of Purim, the halachas of Purim, you probably could do it. You could look it up. You tell me you have to have a meal and you have to hear the Megillah read, give gifts to your friends and give to the poor. But if I said to you, please look up for me and research for me the subject of Jewish faith or trust or free will, most people would know where to begin. Certainly when I ask you to give me an intelligent analysis of the faculty of laughter, what are the tools you use? How do you reach beneath the surface of a subject like this? You need to know the tools. And here I'll share with you a tool which is fundamental and amazingly useful and truly a tool of enlightenment. And that is, there's a notion that everything that manifests in the world is projected from a higher plane. The classic teaching on this, the most explicit teaching on this, is in the classic work of the Ramchal, in Derech Hashem, those of you who'd like to look it up. Right? It's in this work, Derech Hashem, a great, amazing classic. This is an English translation by the Ramchal Lutzato. And in this book, he delineates what he calls Kochos Nivdalim, Kochot Nivdalim. That means transcendental forces. The word Nivdal really means one layer above, or the conventional English translation is transcendent. Everything he says that manifests has a transcendent level. Let's take an example to make this a little bit clearer. Of course, let me point out to you that every level that has a transcendence, that level too has a transcendent level. And of course, so does that, until you get up to the root of all existence, which is Hashem himself. Let's take an example to make this tangible. Perhaps the most important example, take a person. A person has a manifest level, we call that a body, but inside is a transcendent level, which is more real and less physical. The soul, or the personality, the inner being, that life force within, is more real and less material. After all, let's say you love somebody deeply. This is your child, or your dear friend, or someone you're married to. There's two levels. There's a body, which is important, but it's not the essence. The essence is the person inside the body. The physical level is a more material, less essential level. The Koach Nivdal, the soul inside, is less material and more essential. When you relate to a person, right, you need a body, no question about it. You cannot embrace your friend without a body. You can't have a child without a body, but the body's not the point. If you are relating to a human being as a body, if you marry, and what you're interested in is the body, you're on a very vulgar level of human relationship. The body's important, but it's less real than the soul. And anyone with any sense knows, even if your friend's body becomes compromised, even, God forbid, they become paralyzed, it's the person inside that you're relating to. The body's an external, lower, more material, and less essential level. Of course, the soul has a soul too. The nefesh has a ruach. The ruach has a neshama. This is an endless chain of transcendence. That's the important point to realize. But the Ramchal teaches you that it's not only human beings. You should look at a tree that way. If you look at a tree and look only at the tree, you're missing the point big time. If you look at a human being and see only a body, you don't realize the body's a projection of a neshama. You're missing the point big time. And when it comes to human beings, we do this naturally. When someone speaks to you, you know, you can live with someone for 50 years. You'll never see them. All you will ever see is the body. But it's good enough. If you watch every gesture and every nuance of expression and every tone of voice, which are all physical phenomena, it informs you about who the person is, and you get to know them. We have a deep tradition that women do this more naturally than men. Men may have a tendency to be more obstructed at the surface. This is a separate subject for another time. But all of us do this naturally. When you speak to a person, you're not engaging the body. In fact, you do it so naturally, you don't even register the body. When someone's talking to you about something deep and meaningful, you're not registering the movement of the lips and the airwaves and the vibrations of your eardrum. You're using the physical to access an inner level, which is much more real. My friends, anyone who looks at the world and looks at the world as it is without realizing that rippling beneath the surface is an inner being, you're missing the point big time. When you look at a human being and you don't realize there's an inner being, right? That's an insult to what a human being is in your perception of human beings. If you look at a world and forget to realize that there's a being moving within it whom you will never see, you will never see God. You will never see God, just like you'll never see a human soul. But that's because it's less material, but much more real. And that's the way you need to look at the world. Now, this is a long subject, but let's extract one application. Anything you experience, every object, every phenomenon, every human experience, every moment of time is always an outer projection of an inner reality. And the point is to use the external to penetrate and identify and connect with the inner reality. Let's take an example. I'll give you a trivial one and a deep one. People get homesick. Believe me, ask the South Africans. Why do we get homesick? Well, if you ask the scientists, they tell you because a few million years ago when you were a pigeon, the reason you get homesick is because your neshama is longing for the place it came from. You see, in the world of essence, the neshama is exiled in the world, and it's deeply longing, aching for the place that it came from. But that's projected into the trivial projection of your emotions as homesickness. Right? That's the spiritual explanation. Let me take a deep one. There's a thing called dveikus. What should this look like in the projected world? It's supposed to be marriage. It's supposed to be marriage. Marriage is supposed to be two individuals meshing into each other, losing themselves with such fearlessness and such vulnerability and such intensity that they lose personal identity and paradoxically build something larger than the sum of the parts. What happens to you when you lose yourself in a relationship like that? You discover more objectively who you are. And what should you do with that newfound sense of identity? You should put it back in. Now, this is a lost art, as any good woman will tell you, certainly among men, but this is the way it's supposed to be. The Ramban talks about this. The Ramban talks about marital intimacy as the primary learning ground for a relationship with God. But again, the point is that whatever it is in the world of experience is projected from a higher world. And here's the principle. Anything that God wants you to know is projected into your experience. How could he expect you to relate to him if he doesn't give you a tangible level of experience? And everything, here's the rule again, everything that he wants you to know, or technically speaking, every component of his name, he's projected into your experience. And everything you will ever experience is here to teach you something about him. That is the channel of duality. Now, we use that tool. We want to know what the Torah means when it talks about laughter. What is divine laughter? What is Hashem sitting in Shemaim and laughing? The only way you'll ever understand that is to characterize human laughter. Let's understand it in the world of our experience. If you understand what homesickness is, you'll have a deep spiritual insight. If you understand what laughter is, by analyzing it objectively, you will see what spiritual laughter is. And let's do that. In this theme that I'm building with you, I heard from Rav Moshe Shapiro, right? And he told me personally that this was something he worked out himself, right? This is something you will not find many classic sources. Rav Moshe, my great teacher, one of the great minds of the last generation. He once told me that this is a subject that he developed himself. But of course, he's using well-known Torah techniques. And I think you'll see how the subject evolves. Let's look at human laughter. And again, our goal is to understand what human laughter is. And from there, we project it into the meaning in its depth. The first thing you notice about human laughter is that it's uniquely human. First of all, only humans laugh. Only humans laugh. No other part of the biological world laughs. Yes, I know about hyenas, but I can assure you, as a South African who's watched them closely, they've got no sense of humor. I can assure you. So only humans laugh. That's a remarkable phenomenon. And secondly, you can only laugh at something that's human. There's nothing a tree can do that can make you laugh. There's nothing a bicycle can do that can make you laugh. You can only laugh at a distortion of the human. If a tree looks like a person, that might be funny. If a person looks like a tree, you've got that sort of sense of humor, that might be funny. You can only laugh at a distortion of the human. The reason you laugh at animals is only when you impute to them some sort of human consciousness, and then it becomes funny. It's a remarkable thing. No physical object in the world and no phenomenon in the world can possibly make you laugh unless it has a human component or you impute to it some distortion of the human. Laughter is uniquely living in the world of human consciousness. Furthermore, we laugh at things that are really not funny. In fact, I would say probably most of the things we laugh at are embarrassing, humiliating, painful, dangerous, and we laugh at them, which is extremely weird. You know, mother says, Oliver, are you driving on the highway? Yeah, Mom, I'm driving on the highway. Oliver, be very careful. The police say on the radio there's some crazy guy on the highway going the wrong way. He says, Mom, there's hundreds of them. Now you see, that's not funny. Somebody's going to get hurt. But we laugh at it. What is it about us? Are we twisted? Are we sadists? I mean, what is it? When someone goes through an embarrassing experience, this tall, conceited, self-inflated individual slips on a banana peel and falls flat on his back. You have to be 3 years old to laugh at that. But even as you run to help him up, you can't hide a smile because of the absurdity. By the way, when you're going through those experiences, they're not funny at all. They're not funny at all. It's only when you're watching them that they're funny. What is this? Are we cruel? What kind of people are we? That we laugh. And it doesn't matter how bad it gets. There were two fellows on a motorcycle. Look, it's just before Purim, right? You'll permit me to tell a couple of stories. Two fellows on a motorcycle. It was a freezing cold night. So the fellow in front put his leather jacket on backwards, to break the wind. Put it on with the arms in like this, put it on backwards. They had a terrible accident. When the paramedics got back from the accident, they asked them, what did you find at the accident? The paramedics said, unfortunately, the one fellow didn't make it. The other one was doing okay till we tried to turn his head around the right way. Now, you have to be, I would say you have to be, you have to be pathologically, disturbed to laugh at that. But which means that we laugh at things that are bizarre, even when the things objectively are not in any sense funny. What does this mean? Now, this phenomenon of human laughter has been analyzed through the ages, from Aristotle, all the great thinkers. And in fact, today, there's a branch of modern philosophy, believe it or not, which studies laughter. I think I even have a book on it. Yes, here you are. Here is a presentation on put out by one of the an edition of educational university educational thing, and the Professor Stephen Gimble, who, if I'm not mistaken, is Jewish. Professor Stephen Gimble at Gettysburg College is a professor of the philosophy of humor. That's his specialty, right? So you can research that, look him up, and he has made a study. He's only one of many, right? Who have I have a whole literature on the subject of humor, and you will find that this has been richly studied, and it's there are many classic works in this, both modern and ancient. Probably one of the best known is an essay written by Henri Bergson, who was a French philosopher. This goes back maybe 80 years or more. He was Jewish, as it happens. Henri Bergson, a famous writer in evolution and various other things, highly respected French philosopher. And he wrote an essay, a book-length essay called Le Rire, which means laughing, and an analysis of what laughter. You can read it in English. It's a masterful essay. Fails to explain finally the final depth of what laughter is. Freud wrote a masterwork called Der Witz, which means the joke, and its relation to the unconscious. Do I have a copy of that to show you? Yes, here you are. Here's a copy of Freud's work on laughter. It's called Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. Der Witz and its relation to the Unbewusstsein, right? To the unconscious. So it's a classic work of Freud. As you can see, it's a major work. It's an analysis of jokes, by the way. Unfortunately, it's full of anti-Eastern European jokes. You know, Freud was part of the aristocratic Western European Jewish community. And of course, they looked down on Eastern European Jews, but be that as it may. And Freud, as a psychiatrist, tries to come to terms with what is it about the human psyche that needs laughter. As he puts it, what's the psychic gain? What would evolution what was the possible mechanism that humans evolved this? And he fails to explain it. He has a marvelous job of characterizing humor, puns, wordplay, all forms of humor or jokes, and it's well worth reading, but it is a failure in terms of explaining what humor is in depth. And there are many theories. One theory of laughter is called the play theory. It's a sort of an expression of play, laughter. It's a sort of a jocular, playful experience. Does that explain it fully? I would say it explains it partially. There's another theory called the superiority theory, which is that when the man slips on the banana peel, you laugh because you feel superior. It happened to him, not to you. Is that explanatory? Goes some of the way. There's a theory called catharsis theory, that laughter is an explosive release of psychic energy. The humorous situation takes you in one direction and suddenly releases it unexpectedly, and there's that inarticulate expression of joy, which is a release of psychic tension. That's also a valid theory, but I'll tell you the secret. And by the way, there was also an American psychoanalyst called Berger. I think his name, Bergler, Bergler. Do I have his book here? Bergler? I don't know where his book is, but look, if you're interested in the subject, there's a book by Bergler. This is Henri Bergson and his book on laughter, for those that like to. And there's a lot of popular literature on this subject as well. But Bergler wrote, if you're interested in analysis, it's a purely analytical look at humor. And again, there are many classic works that have analyzed humor. But I'll tell you the key. And here comes the thing to focus on closely, because this is the key. The humor is the result of an absurd juxtaposition of opposites. We call this v'nahafoch, and it was reversed. Purim is the story of inversion. When two impossible opposites are put together, the more sharp the contrast and the more unexpected the contrast, the more the humor. When a thing moves in one direction and you suddenly realize it wasn't going that way at all, the traffic wasn't going that way on the highway, it was exactly the other way. That is what results in humor, and that's called v'nahafoch. And professional comedians will do that deliberately. They'll take you in one direction, and when you least expect it, as sharply as possible, they'll flip into its converse. And that flip, that inversion, is what causes laughter. And that inversion does not have to be at all funny. It can be tragic. But as long as it's an inversion into the unexpected opposite, and there's a juxtaposition of the two absurd opposites, right, one becoming the other unexpectedly, that is the secret of laughter. Let's explore this a little bit and see what it means spiritually. Let me put it at its most extreme. I know it sounds a little shocking, but hear me out, and let me try to think this through with you. The most humorous of all possibilities in the world, in life, is when life ends. Because you're talking here about a phenomenon that looks like total, hopeless, final disintegration and decomposition, and yet out of your range of vision begins an existence that makes this one pale into insignificance. You know, let me put it to you like this. A woman who's spiritually disposed can laugh at death. The reason is because she's been through that. Again, it's a woman who's been through, you know, I'll put it to you like this. We have a work called the Gesher HaChaim. The Gesher HaChaim is a classic work on death and dying. It's probably the best known classic halachic work on mourning and the laws of death and so on. In the third volume of that work, he has a section dealing with the spiritual aspects, not the halachic, but the spiritual. And he wants to convey the notion of standing at a graveside, le'aleinu, when somebody's being buried. And he wants to convey to you that through the pain, there should also be a vision of a new dimension opening. Incidentally, that's why it's forbidden to mourn excessively in Judaism. You may not mourn excessively. The reason being, it's a lack of faith. There's a tragedy here. It needs to be mourned, but there'll be a resurrection. One needs to know that in the morning, there'll be a resurrection. You know, in my own private life, the image that comes to mind in my personal life was when I moved to South Africa from Israel, my wife and I lost a pregnancy. It was a beautiful little baby boy that didn't survive. I personally had to do a circumcision on that dead child. That's the custom. That's what you do. You do a circumcision, you bury the child. In the agony of going through that process was also in my mind that we're doing this for a reason. The reason is he'll be part of the family one day. We talk about Ohr Somayach. This is not a final end. So therefore, to mourn excessively means you haven't seen that dimension. And the Gesher Chaim says, when you stand at a grave, the image you should have in your mind is that beyond your range of vision, this person who's leaving you now is moving into a dimension that's vastly larger than this. I'll give you his analogy. And I see at least one pediatrician in the audience who'll appreciate this. He says, imagine two twins in the womb, living this idyllic existence within their mother's body. The verse says, Mi yitneini ki archei kedem. Who could give me like those months that I spent in my mother's body? In this idyllic, perfect existence, learning all of the Torah, knowing everything, cosmic wisdom, and suddenly after months of this experience, these tremors begin and the one child is thrust out into the world. The remaining twin begins to mourn for what will certainly be a death. Little does he know that's where life only begins. You know, let me put it to you like this. When a woman gives birth, the Rambam, I'm quoting here the Rambam quoting the Gemara. The Rambam, as you all know, was a doctor as well. The Rambam says when a woman gives birth, it looks clearly like two people are dying. Clearly. You know, I'm speaking to the gentleman, if I may, for a moment. Imagine you wandering the corridors of your local hospital looking for the accounts department. When you accidentally take a wrong turn and you step into the labor ward and you watch a woman giving birth up close, you know, you'd probably call the police, you know. And if you had to go through that yourself, I guarantee you'd need therapy the rest of you'd need PTSD therapy for the rest of your life. There's no question about that. But it's nothing compared to what the baby goes through. The child goes through a transition that's impossible. The child in the womb has no hope of surviving outside the womb. He has holes in his heart with the blood flowing in the wrong direction. He has a big blood vessel taking all the blood away from the lungs instead of towards it. He's got no lungs. They're little scrunched up bits of tissue. He's got blood vessels coming out through his liver. He's got the wrong sort of blood. The baby in the womb has 20 conditions that keep him alive that spell death within 2 minutes. And you have 20 conditions in your body that keep you alive that if you gave them to the fetus, you'd kill him. You're not talking about changing phase from one phase to another. You're talking about guaranteed death to life. He has a dozen conditions in his body that spell death within 2 minutes. And what happens? And I've delivered dozens of babies. You hold this newborn child in your hands. He goes blue. Then he goes purple. He makes these terrible gasping movements. He's bleeding like crazy through the umbilical. And suddenly as you stand there, the cord clamps down like a cable of steel and stops the bleeding. The holes in the heart close, the blood reverses direction. The blood vessel from the lungs clamps down, the blood hits the lungs. At the same moment he takes his first breath, the lungs pop open, and 3 minutes later, it's all inverted and he's doing fine. That must have taken a lot of orangutans in the trees during evolution to get right by accident. There must have been a lot of chimpanzees that didn't make it. And if you speak to a doctor who understands this, the cascade of chemical phenomena that the biochemistry involved in that. Do you know what? You're talking about holes in, you're talking about a major blood vessel closing down within seconds. You know what the biochemical complexities to get? That blood vessel is sensitive to oxygen levels in the blood, exquisite sensitivity. You're talking about a cascade of transitional elements that happen within a. This is beyond, and that, my friends, is very funny, because you have a situation where the child goes through a transition in which death couldn't be more guaranteed, and amazingly, v'nafoch, it turns around. You know, the Gemara talks about this phenomenon, and I'll share with you one line in the Gemara which is beyond astounding. The Gemara discusses what happens to a baby when it's born, goes through all these changes, and it sums it up in one line. Listen to what the Gemara says. This is on Daf Chaf Tes, if you want to look it up, page 29 in the Masechta Nida. The Gemara says, when a baby's born, what's opened closes, and what's closed opens. Isn't that amazing? That was written 2,000 years ago, right? You cannot say it more succinctly than that. That is what happens when a child is born. Now, it's a woman who's been through that. And therefore, when she looks at death, she's been through that transition. What analogy would you like to find for death better than birth? You're talking about a phase transition from this world to the next. Where would you look for the model? You look for it in the transition from the previous world to this one. And it's a woman who's been through that. And therefore she in her flesh has felt that. And she can therefore look at the day of death and understand what a transition must be. Why do we sing this on Friday night? Because Friday night is the transition from the week to Shabbos, which is a premonition of the transition from this world to a messianic age, which is called a birth. What do we call Mashiach? Chevlei Mashiach, the birth pains of Mashiach. And no accidental metaphors. When our sages talk about the messianic advent as a birth process, you know what they mean? They mean it will be preceded by pains and evidence that there's no hope. The Jewish people's redemption will be preceded by a series of events in the world that are totally genocidally hopeless. You know, let me tell you a medrash. I mean, you can hear Purim. What happened at Purim? There was a decree of genocide. You know, today they throw around the word genocide, amazingly accusing us of genocide. If anybody's been through potential genocide, literally, it's us. What happened at Purim? The Persians made a decree of genocide against the Jewish people. Literal genocide. Not the Jews in Europe, where the Jews in America were safe. You're talking about total genocide. Men, every man, woman, and child in the total known world to be killed by every Jew by real royal edict. Let me point out to you, by the way, without trying to depress you, that edict was made in Persia. Persia, as you know, is Iran. And you know the decree is still in force. You know that. You know that there was a rule in the ancient world that a king was never able to retract a decree. A royal edict could never be revoked. And for good reason. If a royal edict could ever be revoked, the people could never trust it. Maybe the king will change his mind. So there was an absolute rule in the ancient world that a royal edict could never be, and that's why when Esther and Mordechai came to the king, he refused to revoke the decree. They managed to get him to write a new decree that the Jews have a right to defend themselves. By the way, does that ring a chord? You have a right to defend yourselves? What a chutzpah to tell us we have a right to defend ourselves. But the original decree that the Persians made was never revoked. And the modern Persians haven't forgotten it, in case you didn't notice. Iran today, they are explicitly intending to fulfill that decree, a decree of genocide against the Jewish people, and we tend to forget sometimes. They haven't forgotten. So what happened? A decree of genocide against the Jewish people, and every step they take to kill us ends in their destruction and our salvation. Haman makes a noose to hang Mordechai. The Medrash says he climbed up and put his neck in to make sure it would fit. And the angel Gabriel came down and said, suits you. You see, it's a big comedy. The comedy is that exactly what he tries to do to destroy the Jewish people ends up destroying him in exactly the same way and causes a rejuvenation of Torah knowledge in the world which is unprecedented. The Gemara says that Purim was the time of the real acceptance of Torah. That's very funny. Now, it's not funny when you're going through it. This is a birth, right? When a woman's going through it, ask any of the doctors on the panel. Here's a woman saying to you, doctor, I'll never do this again. I'm signing on the line. I will never do it again. Half an hour later, when she's holding the baby in her arms, bring it on. Bring it on. But when you're going through, it's not funny at all. But when you realize that every one of those pains generated a birth, that's a whole different story. And if you're spiritually prepared, you can laugh at it while you're going through it. You know, there's a medrash. If anyone's interested, I'll post it on the website. You can read the medrash yourself. Actually, a series of midrashim. The medrash says that before the Mashiach arrives, the Arabs will have a building on the Temple Mount. Now, this was written before Islam became a religion. You know, Islam became a religion in the 7th century, right, in the mid-600s. This was written by our sages centuries before that the Arabs will have a place. One medrash says Melech HaArvim, right, the king of the Arabs. Another medrash says Bnei Yishmael. No mistaking who we're talking about. They'll have a building on the Temple Mount. At a critical phase in history, just before the Mashiach arrives, the Jews, don't ask me who they are, but the leaders of the Jews go to the Arabs. They say, remove your building. We wish to build the temple. The Arabs say, no, it's our holy site. Does this sound familiar? At that point, the Arabs turn to the Jews and they say, why should we make a battle? Let's make a divine test. We Arabs have faith, in case you hadn't noticed, ready to die at a moment's notice for their religion. We'll make a test. You Jews build an altar like in days of old and put a sacrifice on. We Arabs will do the same thing. And let's see if fire comes from heaven for which of our offerings. But we make a deal with you. If God accepts your offering, we'll follow the Torah. And if God accepts our offering, you follow our religion. And the Jews agree. The Medrash says the Arabs build a mizbech, they put a korban on, a sacrifice. The Jews do the same. and fire comes from heaven to accept the Arab's offering. Well, it's a birth process, isn't it? It's a test, isn't it? It's a series of guaranteed disaster, death, destruction. The Arabs turn to the Jews and they say, we had a deal. The Jews say never. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. There's a battle. Those who survive flee to the desert. And after 30 days of hiding in the desert, the Mashiach arrives. Beautiful medrash. He goes to Hebron, he wakes up their Avos. I once asked the great Rabbi Rav Simcha Wasserman, would it be like that? He said to me, it will be exactly like that. What's being said here? We're talking about Chevlei Mashiach, birth pains. The Talmud says, let it come, but let me not see it. That's the notion we have of the pain of the messianic transition. And therefore, it's a woman who's been through that. And therefore, we call it the birth process of Mashiach. We talk about a situation. There's a classic work on this, the Das Tunis, by the Ramchal. A great classic work on how the tragedies of history are building redemption. The only question is, when can you laugh at it? Let's take a few examples. By the way, I'm sure you all know, you must know, the Talmud repeatedly talks about Rabbi Akiva, the father of the oral law, together with the sages, his contemporaries. And the classic example, of course, is the end of the Gemara Makos. Rabbi Akiva is walking around on the site of the destruction of the temple with his contemporary rabbis, and they see the destroyed temple, the ruins of the raised ground where the temple should stand, and suddenly, unexpectedly, a fox runs out of the zone of the Holy of Holies. And the rabbis begin wailing. They begin crying with tremendous mourning for the desolation of that place. And Rabbi Akiva starts laughing. He starts laughing. They say, Rabbi, why are you laughing? He says, why are you crying? They say, because we know there's a verse in the Torah that tells us that foxes will stroll on the site of the destruction, and we see it before our eyes. Should we not mourn? He says, that's why I'm laughing. Because when you see the verse in the Torah that predicts foxes on the Temple Mount, and that came true, then you know that the next verse that talks about children playing in the streets of Jerusalem will come true as well. Right? And that's why he's laughing. Now, my friends, it's obvious the rabbis knew those verses too. But they're experiencing what's going on now. They're responding to the situation. This is a situation of destruction. But Rabbi Akiva is a woman giving birth. He can look into he can know that every one of these pains is generating a redemption. The only question now is, how far-sighted are you spiritually? And the whole Torah is like this. Here's an example. Here's Pharaoh. We don't have time to go into all the examples, but I'll give you one or two. Here's Pharaoh sitting on his throne, and he's making a decree to kill every baby boy that's born. Every child is thrown into the river. You know, the Medrash says he had the Egyptian boys killed as well. You know that, because his astrologers couldn't tell him if the Redeemer would be Jewish or Egyptian. Of course they couldn't tell him, because Moses was a little bit of both. So to make sure, he has every boy killed. And on his knee, he's raising the child that he's trying to kill. That is very funny. Right? This is the story of the Torah. It is a story of spiritual humor. These things are not funny when you're going through them. But when you understand the message here, you understand that Hashem is sitting in heaven and he's laughing because every step of the wicked is generating their downfall and our redemption. You know, the first Jewish child ever born is called Isaac. Yitzchak means laughter. It's a strange name for a child, but his parents called him laughter. Yitzchak, of course, means he shall laugh. We're talking about what in English we call the last laugh. We're not talking about Jewish history as a laughing matter. We're talking about the last laugh. So here's the story of Isaac, Yitzchak. His father's 100 years old. There's no way you can have a child. His mother's 90. She doesn't have a womb, according to the Talmud. No hope of a child. So God appears to them and says, you'll have a baby. So they laugh. Of course you laugh. Laughter is the response to the impossible. Of course they laugh. And what happens when the child is born? And some child, right? The forerunner of the Jewish people. As soon as he's old enough to get married, God says to his father, that's great, now kill him. You understand, the Torah is one long black comedy. So Avram takes his son, and he builds an altar, and he puts him on it, and he stretches his neck. And what happens? The Torah says he didn't kill him. The Zohar says he was killed. The Zohar says he was killed. Why? Because the Medrash says the ashes of Yitzchak remained on the altar. In fact, the Zohar says as the knife approached his throat, his soul left, and as the knife receded, his soul came back. Actually, the Zohar says his soul came back as a fertile soul, including a female element. There's a long Kabbalistic discussion here. But Isaac went through a situation where he was killed and he survived. Is that possible? No. but it happened. We begin where the impossible ends. And what was the next event in Isaac's life, Yitzchak's life? He goes off and gets married and founds a nation that becomes indestructible. Yitzchak becomes a human being, having gone through a death-life process. We call that Tchias HaMesim. That's called resurrection. On the one hand, he survives, narrowly survives. On the other hand, his ashes remain on the altar. And he becomes the father of a nation that for 4,000 years they've been trying to kill us, and we're still here. That's very funny. For 4,000 years, most of that time without a country, without an army, without a police force, totally defenseless, a speck of humanity. And by the way, even when he had a country, you know how big Israel is? It's smaller than the Kruger National Park. You can run across it in a day. You can jog from Jerusalem, Tel Aviv in half a day. That's at the good times. And for 4,000 years, they've been trying to gas us like cockroaches and wipe us out. And we still hear the most creative, vibrant, intellectual pinnacle of humanity. That's very funny. And that's what the Zohar says, the Tikkunei Zohar says, Yitzchak, the name spells Ketz Chai. Look at the letters in Hebrew. Yitzchak, Ketz Chai, death in life. That's what Isaac means, death in life. Ketz Chai, the next world in this world. He's a human being who walks around with his feet in this world and his head in a different world. That's the Jewish people. And wherever you touch it, you'll see the same thing. One more example. One more example. Where does our story begin? In Egypt. Where does that story begin? With the brothers and Joseph. You know the story. They sold their brother. Disaster sets in. Their father loses his prophecy. 20 years they suffer the knowledge that they've derailed Jewish history. Doesn't get worse than that. And then it gets worse. There's a famine. There's no food. And this weird Egyptian starts tormenting them. They don't know it's their brother. They don't know that he's putting them through a revision of what they did 20 years before to correct what they did. They don't know that. They go through bizarre torment. And finally, the crunch comes. They finally stand in front of him. And Joseph says to them, you know what? You can all go home. Just leave Benjamin behind. Just leave Benjamin behind. At that moment, the world ended. If you want to look this up in the Sfas Emes, he speaks it out most beautifully. The world ended because at that time, they had only two options. Either go home with food and leave Benjamin and watch their father die of grief. As he sees them in the distance and realizes that Benjamin is not among them, he dies of grief instantly. Or take Benjamin and kill everyone. They were superhuman in their powers. Kill all the Egyptians, become mass murderers, and get out that way. At that point in time, after 20 years of awareness of total failure at a cosmic scale, now with no options facing them, Yehuda steps forward and he says, I don't know what this means. This is too bizarre for words. I know we're responsible. Although the meaning of these events with an Egyptian tormentor, I have no idea what this means. But I know one thing. I promised my father I'd bring him home. And therefore, let him go, take me. And that moment of total abject negation of self, with no options at all, with total destruction staring him in the face, they hear the words, Ani Yosef. I'm Joseph. You, the source of the problem. Not the cavalry riding in to save them. You! In that instant, suddenly the whole world has been inverted. In that moment, they realize that every moment of tragedy and every moment of pain has become their redemption. This is a woman holding the baby in her arms who now realizes that every pain brought that child into the world. Of course, they weren't laughing. They were paralyzed. The Medrash says they couldn't move. Joseph had to kiss them. He had to hug them. He had to show them his circumcision. He had to speak to them in Hebrew. They couldn't move. Because when you're going through it, it's not funny at all. But when you're watching, it's hysterical. The redemption doesn't come as the source of the problem. That's called Vanaf, right? This is the story of Jewish history. I'll leave you with a message. The message is, you know what? I'll leave you with a message and a story. And maybe since I see some South Africans here, I'll tell you two stories. The message is for those who need practical message. You know, this is theory and philosophy. What's the practical message? The practical message is that you need to live upside down. You need to live upside down. The world will be turned upside down. The solution is to live upside down right now. You need to choose values exactly the opposite of the world's values. Raise your children to think exactly the opposite to the way the world thinks. what they think is value. You develop an attitude to living on your head. And in that near day when the Mashiach arrives and the world's turned upside down, we'll be the right way up. That's Jewish attitude. But today it's so easy. You look at a world of such crazy, ridiculous falsehood with the unashamed falsehood and distortions and complete inversion of values. Today it should be easy. Anyway, that's the theme. We're aiming to be a Rabbi Akiva who can look at a world of destruction and see where this is going. Doesn't mean you're laughing at this point in time. That would be insensitive. But you realize you have the faith to know that labor pains are labor pains and they have a result. And we live in a set of values that is contrary to the world's. Here's a story I'll leave you with. Now, the South Africans will recognize this as a fundamental story. I'm not going to explain what that means, but they know what I mean. This is a character who, a national character who goes through these sorts of experiences. Anyway, be that as it may, he's driving along one day with his friend who's driving, and they come to a red light, and his friend goes straight through the red light. He says to him, "What are you doing?" He said, "No, don't worry, my brother always does." Next red light, speeds right through the red light. He said, "What are you doing? You'll get us killed." He said, "No, it's okay. My brother always does this." Next red light, speeds through the red light. "You drive like that. Don't worry, my brother always does." Next light's green, and the fellow screeches to a halt. He says to him, "What are you doing now?" He says, "No, man, in case my brother's coming through." Anyway, that is the story. And we are driving with the rules that we feel appropriate. We drive on the side of the road that we feel is right. We go through the signals the way we read them. Right? That is the message. Our heads are turned around the right way, if you get my drift. And therefore, we are understanding the humor, the spiritual humor of life. Again, no one's claiming that things are funny when they're happening. But Purim is an instruction in V'na'afoch, right? The Megillah says a number of times, V'na'afoch, it was inverted. That which you don't understand, which lives behind a mask, and that's the hilarity of Purim. When we go through this hilarity, people walking up dressed like Haman. What are you thinking? The answer is, we are mocking the impending inversion. Right? That's what we're doing. And that is Jewish humor. Jews have an amazing sense of humor. We've needed it. We've needed it to survive. And that's the depth. Superficially, it's good for your emotions. It's good for your hormones. It's good for your physiology. Need to laugh. But at a deep level, it's good for your soul. Thank you for joining me. I wish everybody a wonderful Purim. Imiyat Hashem will live through an inversion where the wicked will be shown to be wicked. The ones who need to be vindicated will be vindicated. The world will be set to rights. And we'll live in a world of Az Yimale Srok Pinu. Then our mouth shall be full of laughter. All the best.